The barn door hasn't opened in years. Dust coats the hinges. Inside, chains hang from every rafter. Feeder house chains, elevator chains, drive chains. Hundreds of them. Labeled in a quiet man's handwriting. Earl Briggs saved all of it. In 1987, his neighbors called it junk. Earl just nodded and kept working. What looks worthless isn't. And when one supplier controls every replacement part for 50 miles, that truth has a price. Number 1. The Case IH1460 feeder house chain. Picture a September morning in central Illinois, 1989. The soybean fields are turning gold and brittle, and every combine in the county needs to be running by the end of the week. Earl Briggs, lean, deliberate, a man who measures twice and speaks once, is standing inside a dealer's service bay in Pontiac, watching a parts counter employee toss a feeder house chain into a scrap bin without a second glance. The chain came off a Case IH1460 combine. The 1460 was a workhorse machine, one of the most widely used combines across the Corn Belt through the 1980s. Its feeder house chain is the backbone of the whole harvesting operation, a heavy roller chain that drags cut crop material from the header up into the threshing cylinder. When that chain stretches, skips, or snaps, the machine stops. The field stops. Everything stops. And in harvest season, every idle hour costs real money. The dealer's employee had written the chain off at $12 scrap value. Worn, he said, stretched beyond spec, not worth the time to evaluate. Earl asked if he could have it. The employee shrugged and said, "Sure, take it. It's garbage." Earl put it in the bed of his truck and drove the 40 minutes back to his farm outside Chenoa without saying much. That was Earl's way. He didn't argue about value. He demonstrated it. Back in the barn, he hung the chain from a hook on the center beam and let it straighten under its own weight for 2 full days. Then he went to work. Link by link, he cleaned each roller with a wire brush and a shallow pan of diesel fuel. Working in the gray light that came through the barn's single south-facing window. He wasn't rushing. Earl never rushed. He was measuring, feeling for the links that had seized, identifying the ones where the side plates had begun to bow, checking each pin for wear with a set of calipers he'd owned since 1974. A feeder house chain on a 1460 runs at brutal tension. The crop load is uneven, the chain reverses under slug conditions, and the sprocket engagement is punishing on the outer links. What Earl was looking for were the links that could be restored and the ones that needed to be replaced individually. He wasn't rebuilding the chain from scratch. He was triaging it. The same methodical patience a watchmaker brings to a movement, applied to a piece of agricultural hardware that most people would throw in a dumpster. He sourced replacement pins and rollers from 2 separate suppliers, one in Bloomington, one through a mail-order catalog out of Kankakee. Cross-referencing pitch dimensions against a worn copy of a chain manufacturer's Institute specification sheet, he kept folded in the top drawer of his workbench. The pitch on the 1460 feeder house chain is 1.654 inches. Earl knew that number the way other men know their phone numbers. When the repair was done, he measured the chain's total assembled length against the factory specification. It was within tolerance. He hung it on a nail on the east wall of the barn, and he labeled it. The label was a strip of masking tape, written in black marker, 1460FH, 1989, R, meaning repaired. Below that, the date and the pitch measurement he'd confirmed. The chain went into a coffee can, one of the large 3-pound Folgers cans that Earl bought specifically for storage. Lids intact, sealed with a second strip of tape around the rim to keep moisture out. He set the can on a shelf he'd built from 2x4s along the north wall, where the temperature stayed coolest in summer. By 1991, that shelf held 11 coffee cans. By 1994, it had expanded to a second shelf. Earl had a catalog system, a spiral notebook where every can had an entry: machine model, chain type, condition at acquisition, repairs performed, current status. The notebook sat on the workbench next to the calipers. Visitors to the barn, the few who came, would glance at the rows of labeled cans and the hanging chains above, and not quite know what they were looking at. Earl's neighbor, Dave Kowalski, told people Earl was collecting junk. Earl's wife, Margaret, said he was collecting insurance. Margaret was right, but neither of them fully understood yet how right she was, because here is what was happening in the background. Invisible to everyone in Livingston County in 1989, the agricultural supply chain was consolidating. Dealers were dropping slow-moving part numbers. Distributors were rationalizing their inventories. The parts that moved fast, filters, belts, common bearings, stayed on the shelves. The parts that moved slow, specialty chains for machines a decade old, feeder house components for combines that were being retired, were quietly disappearing from the catalogs. Not all at once, gradually. The way a tide goes out. Earl didn't know the economic term for what was happening. He just knew that every time he called a dealer for an older chain specification, the answer was getting longer and the price was getting higher. He knew that the 1460 feeder house chain the employee had thrown in the scrap bin in Pontiac was not actually garbage. It was a component that, with $40 of materials and 4 hours of careful labor, could be returned to service, and that the next time a farmer in a wet October needed that chain, he might not be able to find one anywhere. So Earl kept saving them. Every chain that came through a dealer's scrap bin, every component pulled off a machine headed to the salvage yard, every worn drive chain that a neighbor was about to throw away, Earl asked for it. Sometimes he paid a few dollars. Usually he just took it. The barn filled slowly, methodically, one coffee can at a time. And now it is harvest season again. The fields outside Chenoa are ready. The combines are being pulled out of machine sheds across Livingston County. And somewhere in that county, a 1460 feeder house chain is going to fail. The question is, who has one? The question is, who thought to save it? But the feeder house chain is only the beginning of what Earl kept. Because hanging on the wall just to the left of that first shelf, coiled on a wooden peg Earl drove into the barn siding with a 16-penny nail, is a drive chain from an International Harvester 1066 tractor. And the story behind that one is something else entirely. Number 2 on the wall is that International Harvester 1066 drive chain. And the moment Earl pulled it from the tractor it came from, most people would have left it exactly where it lay. The year was 1993. The 1066 itself had been sitting behind a co-op storage building in Harlan, Iowa, since roughly 1987. 6 years of open sky. 6 years of freeze and thaw and freeze again. The sheet metal had gone the color of old blood, and the cab glass had a crack running corner to corner like a fault line waiting to finish the job. The foreman at that co-op, a heavy-set man named Gerald Briggs who wore the same green cap every single day Earl ever saw him, walked Earl out to the machine and gestured at it the way you gesture at something you want hauled to a landfill. Gerald called it worthless iron. His exact words, worthless iron. He said the drivetrain was seized, the hydraulics were weeping rust-colored fluid into the soil, and that whoever had parked it there had essentially donated it to the concept of entropy. Gerald wanted it gone. He didn't want money for it. He wanted the embarrassment of it removed from his property line. Earl Dunning. And if you've been following along, you already know Earl, the quiet man with the measuring tape always folded in his left breast pocket, the man who drove a 1978 Ford pickup with a cracked dash and a passenger seat permanently occupied by a yellow legal pad. Earl didn't look at the 1066 the way Gerald looked at it. Earl looked at the drive chain, he crouched down in the Iowa mud. Right there behind the co-op building with Gerald watching like Earl had lost his mind. And he ran his thumb along the outer plates of that chain. Rust. Yes. Surface rust. The kind that looks catastrophic but behaves like a costume. Underneath, Earl could feel the plate steel was still true. No warping. No lateral flex where there shouldn't be lateral flex. He pulled a short length of it free with his bare hands. It moved, stiffly, but it moved. And he looked at the pitch spacing the way a jeweler looks at a stone. Back in the truck, Earl unfolded that measuring tape and confirmed what his thumb had already told him. The pitch measured out clean. He counted links on the section he'd freed, 78 total, running end to end without a single twisted plate in the sequence. 78 links. He wrote that number down on the yellow legal pad in the passenger seat, circled it twice, and sat there for a moment with the engine idling. Gerald Briggs was still standing by the co-op door when Earl walked back over and asked if he could take the drive chain off the machine entirely. Gerald shrugged. Gerald said take the whole tractor if Earl wanted it. Earl said he just needed the chain. Gerald shrugged again. That was the transaction. No money changed hands. The worthless iron gave up one of its most valuable organs, and nobody at that co-op watched Earl loaded into the truck bed. The chain came home to the barn, and this is where Earl's ritual begins. The ritual that anyone who has spent time with Earl will describe with a kind of reverence because it never varied. Not once, not across 30-plus years of salvage work. First came the soaking tank, a galvanized stock tank, the kind meant for cattle water, filled with a diesel and penetrating oil mixture that Earl had refined by trial and error over years until he found the ratio that worked best for his particular Iowa climate. The chain went in. It stayed in for no fewer than 48 hours. Earl checked it at the 24-hour mark, not to pull it out, but just to look at the surface color change, the way a cook checks a slow braise, not because it's ready, but because watching it tells you something. After the soak came the wire brush, a bench-mounted rotary wire wheel that Earl had bolted to a section of 2-inch angle iron welded to his workbench. He ran every single link through that wheel, both faces, both edges, the roller surfaces between the plates. Not hurrying. Earl Dunning did not hurry. He once told a younger neighbor named Dale Fossum, Dale ran a small custom baling operation 2 miles east, that the wire wheel was where you found out whether a chain was worth keeping or worth discarding, and that if you rushed that step, you were essentially lying to yourself about what you had. The 1066 drive chain passed the wire wheel without a single link showing fatigue cracking or pitting deep enough to compromise the roller bore. Earl set it on the bench under a shop light and went over it link by link with a magnifying loupe he'd bought at a farm auction in 1989 for 75 cents. Then came the tension gauge. Earl had built his own tension gauge fixture from a piece of square steel tubing and a dial indicator salvaged from a broken micrometer set. The kind of improvised precision instrument that shouldn't work as well as it does, but somehow works perfectly. He measured the elongation across a 10-link span, compared it against the factory spec he'd copied by hand from an IH service manual at the county extension office, and wrote the result on a piece of masking tape that he stuck to the first outer plate of the chain. The tape read, "Within spec, 1993, IH 10066. He coiled the chain, hung it on a wooden peg he drove into the barn siding with a 16-penny nail, and that was that. Gerald Briggs's worthless iron became the second item on Earl's wall, and Earl went back to his yellow legal pad and wrote something underneath the circled 78. He wrote, "Second shelf starts here." That note matters, because Earl wasn't just collecting anymore. He was organizing. The first shelf, the one holding the Case IH 1460 feeder house chain, had been instinct. The second shelf was intention. Earl had started to understand. In that quiet way, Earl understood most things, not with a speech or a declaration. but with a circled number and a masking tape label, that he was building something. He didn't know yet exactly what he was building. He couldn't have known in 1993 what the supply chain landscape would look like 20 years later, 30 years later. But some part of him understood that machines like the 1066 were being written off faster than the parts ecosystem could absorb them, and that the chains coming off those machines were going somewhere permanent if someone didn't catch them on the way down. The second barn shelf filled quietly after that. Not all at once. A link here, a set there. Each one going through the soaking tank, the wire wheel, the tension gauge, the masking tape label. Each one earning its peg. Earl's barn started to smell permanently of diesel and penetrating oil, and the particular metallic sharpness of wire-brushed steel, a smell that Dale Fossum would later describe as the smell of someone taking the long view. And on the shelf, just below the 1066 chain, there was a gap that Earl had left deliberately, a gap the exact width of a Gleaner L2 grain elevator chain set, because Earl already knew what was coming next, and he'd built the shelf to hold it before he'd even found the chain. At number 3, we arrive at the Gleaner L2, and this one requires a moment of context before we get to the chain itself, because the chain is only half the story. The other half is what happened to the people who needed it and didn't have Earl's number. The Gleaner L2 was a combine harvester built by Alice Chalmers through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, a machine with a devoted following in the grain belt that was almost entirely disproportionate to the attention the broader industry paid it. Farmers who ran L2s tended to run them hard and run them long, the way certain people stay loyal to a particular truck model long after the manufacturer has moved on. The L2 had a reputation for clean grain handling and a straw walker design that some operators swore was better than anything that came after it. But by the mid-1990s, the parts infrastructure for the L2 was quietly collapsing. Alice Chalmers had been absorbed into a succession of corporate entities, and the regional dealer network that had once stocked L2-specific components was making decisions based on turnover data that the L2 simply couldn't compete with. In 1997, the regional dealer serving Earl's part of Iowa stopped stocking L2 parts entirely, not reduced stock. Entirely. The service manager posted a notice on the parts counter, a handwritten note on yellow paper, the kind of administrative gesture that tries to be apologetic but mostly just is what it is, explaining that L2 components were now special order only, subject to availability, with lead times that could run 8 to 12 weeks. For a farmer in the middle of a harvest window, 8 to 12 weeks is not a lead time. It is a sentence. Earl Dunning heard about the dealer's decision from Dale Fossum, who had heard it from a farmer named Vern Schreiber, who ran 2 L2s on his operation outside of Avoca. Vern Schreiber was the kind of farmer who kept his machines in condition that made other farmers slightly embarrassed about their own equipment. Clean, painted where it needed paint, greased on schedule. And the news about the dealer had hit Vern hard. He'd driven to the dealer himself to confirm it, stood at the parts counter with his hat in his hands, and been told politely that the decision was final. Earl drove out to Vern's place the following Saturday, not to sell Vern anything. Earl didn't work that way. He drove out there because he wanted to look at a running L2 up close, and because Vern, he knew, would let him. Vern walked Earl through both machines in the equipment shed, and Earl spent a long time crouched under the grain elevator housing of the first one, studying the elevator chain where it ran through the lower boot and up the elevator tube. The L2 grain elevator chain was a specific beast, a double-strand roller chain with extended attachment links for the elevator paddles, running in a loop that had to maintain consistent tension across a span that could flex and shift as the machine worked through uneven terrain. If that chain stretched beyond tolerance, grain spillage inside the elevator housing could become severe. If it broke mid-harvest, you were done for the day, maybe done for the season. Earl wrote the chain specifications down on the yellow legal pad, He noted the strand pitch, the attachment link spacing, the total loop length. Then he drove home and started making calls. It took him 3 weeks, but Earl found a farm equipment liquidator in Ottumwa who had acquired the contents of a closed implement dealership, and inside that inventory were 3 complete Gleaner L2 grain elevator chain sets, still in their original packaging, sitting in a cardboard box that had been sitting in a back room since approximately 1984. The liquidator had no idea what he had. He knew they were chains. He knew they were old. He sold all 3 sets to Earl for $40 total, which worked out to roughly $13.30 per set, which was, even by 1997 standards, a price that should have felt like a mistake to somebody. Earl put the $40 on the counter in cash, loaded the box into the passenger seat of the Ford pickup — the yellow legal pad had to ride in the back for once — and drove home. The 3 sets went through the ritual. Every chain that came into Earl's barn went through the ritual. No exceptions, no shortcuts. The galvanized soaking tank with the diesel and penetrating oil mixture. 48 hours minimum, because Earl had learned that with chains that had been sitting in original packaging for over a decade, the factory lubricant inside the roller bores had often hardened to a consistency that surface cleaning alone couldn't address. The soak was about penetration. It was about reaching the interior of the joint. The interior of the joint, the space between the inner and outer plates where the pin rotated, where the real wear would eventually live. After the soak, the navel jelly. Earl had added navel jelly to his rust removal process sometime in the early 1990s after Dale Fossum mentioned it in passing during a conversation about boat trailer maintenance, of all things. Navel jelly, a phosphoric acid gel that converts iron oxide into iron phosphate, essentially neutralizing rust at the chemical level rather than just abrading it away, turned out to be extraordinarily well suited to the attachment link areas of elevator chains, where the extended tabs created surface geometry that the wire wheel couldn't always reach cleanly. Earl applied it with a stiff, bristled brush, let it dwell for 20 minutes, then rinsed it with a garden hose before the wire wheel pass. The wire wheel came next, the same bench-mounted rotary wheel, the same methodical link-by-link progression. Earl ran the L2 elevator chains through that wheel with the same unhurried attention he brought to every chain in the barn. Then the oil bath, a separate pan of clean machine oil, warm, that Earl heated on a hot plate to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, just warm enough to allow the oil to wick fully into the roller joints by capillary action. The chains went in for 30 minutes. They came out dark and gleaming and smelling like a working machine shop in the best possible way. He labeled each set with masking tape. 1997, Gleaner L2, elevator full set. And he hung them on the shelf below the IH1066 chain, in the gap he had built the shelf to hold. 3 sets. Enough to keep 2 machines running through multiple seasons if the chains were maintained properly between replacements. Enough, potentially, to save a harvest for a farmer who had nowhere else to turn. Earl didn't think about it in those terms at the time. Or if he did, he didn't say so to anyone. Not to Dale Fossum, not to Vern Schreiber, not to anyone. He just filled the gap on the shelf and went back inside and made coffee. Vern Schreiber ran his L2s for another 11 years after that dealer posted the handwritten notice. 11 years. He never had to wait 8 to 12 weeks for an elevator chain. There were other farmers in that same region who weren't as fortunate, farmers who hadn't heard about Earl's barn, farmers who made the call to the regional dealer and got the news about special order only and lead times, and made the calculation that it was time to retire the L2 and buy something the supply chain still cared about. Some of them made that decision in the middle of a harvest. Some of them made it with grain standing in the field. Earl's barn was getting full. The wall of wooden pegs had spread from the original section of siding to the adjacent wall. The masking tape labels had started to form a kind of catalog, a handwritten inventory of machines the industry had decided to forget, preserved in diesel and navel jelly and careful attention. each label a small argument against the logic that said old iron had no future. And then, in 2022, a name appeared in the agricultural parts trade press that made some people nervous and made Earl Dunning put down his coffee cup and look out the barn window for a long moment. The name was First Brands Group, and the cracks that name suggested were not the surface kind that a wire wheel could fix. Number 4. And this one is different. Not because the chain is more obscure, not because the price is higher, though the price tells its own story. This one is different because of what Earl Dunning knew, and when he knew it, and how many people told him he was wrong, the John Deere 4440. If you ran row crops in the Midwest between 1977 and 1982, you know this tractor the way you know your own reflection. 130 horsepower, quad-range transmission, sound guard cab that felt like a cockpit the first time you climbed in. Farmers bought them by the thousands. Then they kept them. Then their sons kept them. Then their sons kept them after that. The 440 is not a tractor that gets retired. It gets handed down like a last name. And a working 4440 needs a working PTO drivetrain. The power takeoff chain on that machine is not a glamorous component. It does not have a story the way an engine does. It sits in the dark, transferring torque from the gearbox to whatever implement is spinning behind the tractor, and it does that job quietly until one day it doesn't. When it fails, you don't always hear it coming. One field pass it's fine, the next pass it isn't. And then you need a chain, and you need it before the weather window closes. Earl understood that math long before anyone put it in a spreadsheet. Between 2003 and 2012, Earl Dunning, the same broad-shouldered man who had been walking that barn in Hardin County since his father built the east wall, accumulated 14 PTO chains for the John Deere 444014. He didn't buy them all at once. He bought them the way a careful man buys anything he knows will eventually cost more and eventually become harder to find. One here, two there. Sometimes he'd pull into a dealer on the way home from somewhere else just to check the shelf. If the price was right, he'd add one to the inventory. He stacked them in the northeast corner of the barn, still in their original packaging, tagged with the date and the price paid in black marker. Total outlay for all 14 chains, $310. People who heard about it laughed. Not mean laughter mostly. The kind of laughter that comes from not being able to see what someone else sees. Why would you need 14 of the same chain? Why would you tie up cash in a part that might sit on a shelf for a decade? Earl didn't argue. He just kept buying when the price made sense and kept stacking them in the corner. Here is what Earl saw that the laughter missed. John Deere had been quietly, methodically tightening its grip on the parts supply chain for years. The dealer network was not just a sales channel. It was becoming a control mechanism. Independent repair shops found it harder to source genuine Deere components at prices that let them stay competitive. Dealers were raising prices on slow-moving parts because they could, because the alternative for a farmer with a broken 4440 in a wet October was not to shop around. The alternative was to pay whatever the dealer was asking or watch the crop sit. Earl had watched the price on that PTO chain climb from roughly $22 in the early 2000s to over $40 by the time he stopped counting. Same chain, same part number, different world. In 2025, the Federal Trade Commission filed suit against Deere & Company, and the complaint read like a document Earl could have written himself. The FTC alleged that Deere had systematically restricted independent repair access, controlled the diagnostic software that dealers used, and structured its parts distribution in ways that locked farmers into the dealer network, whether they wanted to be there or not. The suit used the phrase lock-in pattern. It described practices that had been building for at least 2 decades. 2 decades. That covers almost the entire span of years when Earl was stacking chains in the northeast corner of the barn. He wasn't paranoid. He was reading the same signals the FTC eventually put into a federal complaint. He was just reading them from a barn in Hardin County instead of from an office in Washington. Picture that corner of the barn right now. 14 paper and cardboard packages, each one tagged in Earl's handwriting, stacked with the precision of a man who respects inventory. The afternoon light comes through the gap in the siding and falls across them at an angle. Outside, the fields are doing what fields do in that part of Ohio in late summer, sitting heavy and gold, waiting. Inside, the chains wait too, patient, quiet, worth exactly what Earl always knew they were worth. His neighbors had laughed in 2006, in 2008, in 2011. Each time the story came up at the co-op or at the elevator, someone would shake their head and smile. Earl and his chains, Earl and his barn full of parts nobody needs. But here's the thing about a laugh. It has a shelf life. Because the name that appeared in the agricultural parts trade press, the name that made Earl set down his coffee and look out the barn window, was not just a rumor. First Brands Group was not just a company having a rough quarter. The cracks that name suggested were structural. And when structural things break, they don't send a warning. They don't call ahead. The phones just go quiet. The orders just stop being filled. And the farmer standing in a broken down field with a failed PTO chain and a closing weather window finds out very quickly that the shelf he was counting on is empty. Earl already knew what an empty shelf felt like from the other side. The question was how many of his neighbors were about to find out for the first time. In 2025, First Brands Group collapsed into bankruptcy, cutting 1,267 jobs and pulling critical supply lines out from under independent parts distributors across the country. Outside, across Hardin County, combines sat idle while corn hit $6.89 a bushel and every hour mattered. But the laughter that used to follow Earl Dunning's name had stopped completely, replaced by the sound of truck headlights sweeping across his gravel drive after dark, one neighbor at a time, hats in hand. The barn nobody wanted to look inside had become the only light still on for miles. Subscribe for more stories of quiet, stubborn foresight, the people who held on when everyone else let go. Hit subscribe and stay close. The next story is already waiting in the dark.